Welcome everyone to Citizen Diplomacy International. My name is Paul Lachelier. I'm the founder and the director of Learning Life, the DC-based nonprofit that runs CDI, or Citizen Diplomacy International. And I'm the chair of these quarterly meetings. As I mentioned, if you haven't seen it already in the Zoom chat, please do introduce yourselves in the Zoom chat, including your name, your city, your country, your occupation, and why you're interested and or involved in citizen diplomacy. Feel free to cut and paste your bio if you have a bio available online. So a little bit about Citizen Diplomacy International. It's one of our three programs, and it is based on the sense that citizen diplomacy is kind of playing a growing role in international affairs, in part because of globalization, the rise of the internet, increasing education levels, and long-term democratization. The CDI currently is just 4 meetings a year. This is the last of our meetings this year. We will have another 4 meetings next year. And then we also, alongside these meetings, produce a bulletin that this year has been co-edited with Brian Smith, who's with us, who will be presenting the latest bulletin at the end of this meeting. Look forward to more information about the details of meetings upcoming next year. We'll be sending that via email. If you're not already on our email list, I would encourage you to just private message me with your email address, and I will make sure that you're added to our email list so that you get notice of our quarterly meetings. Okay, so we are going to get started. I should note that one of our speakers, Farhat Asif, it is quite possible that she is not able to join us because political events are impeding her, essentially. She lives in Pakistan, and right now there's political unrest in Pakistan, which means the government is shutting down the internet. And so we may not be able to see her, unfortunately, but we do have our 2 other speakers with us, and I'm going to have, and they will each speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll have discussion for about 40 minutes, and then announcements and a CD bulletin at the end. Without further ado, we're going to have Semhar Araya speak first, and then Kadir Jun Ayan, and I am probably butchering your name, and I apologize, Kadir, if I'm doing so. But Kadir will speak second. So Semhar, you're first. Please introduce yourself.
Oh, thank you. Good morning, everyone from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I'm still here on holiday travel. I'm really pleased to be here with all of you. I will have a presentation that I'll flip over to in a second. But just before I do, I just want to also say hello to some familiar faces I see here. And having worked on diplomacy, both formal diplomacy and track 2 diplomacy, citizen diplomacy is a part of it, I think this is a fantastic space. And thank you, Paul, for creating this space and offering these kinds of convenings and allowing people from around the world to really understand all the ways that they can amplify their role as citizen diplomats. So what I'm going to talk about today is the role of diaspora communities in citizen diplomacy. And for many of you, I don't know the range of experience or expertise you have on diaspora engagement. So I'm just going to begin and assume that we're starting from the same starting point. But as it relates to citizen diplomacy, I think you'll see a lot of different elements of ways that diasporas are critical change agents and advocates for peace building, conflict resolution, and diplomacy. Let me flip over now to the slides, which you'll see will give you better intro. And can you guys see the screen, Paul?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. And all right, so great. So let's go into a little bit about what we're going to discuss in the next 10 to 15 minutes. First, I'd love to introduce myself a little bit more, just way of background, but also the organization that I have started called the Diaspora Academy, and why we've established the Diaspora Academy as a key place for diaspora changemakers to find support around the world. And then, of course, the ways in which that diasporas drive change and positive impact as citizen diplomats. Lastly, I'm going to give you all some recommendations of things that you can consider in your own ecosystem, whether it's at a university or in a place of employment or in your own personal life. There are many ways that diaspora communities are ripe and ready for engaging around citizen diplomacy. So, by way of introduction, I am a trained lawyer, but I worked initially in conflict resolution as a lawyer for a peace process between Eritrea and Ethiopia in 2000. And then I moved over into public policy and I worked in US government. So, after having completed law school and volunteering as a member of the Eritrean American community, I learned a lot about the role of diasporas in development. And so shortly after concluding my time as a lawyer for the peace process, I switched over into public policy and started to see all the ways that diaspora individuals and communities are really involved in issues regarding foreign policy, development, conflict resolution, peace building. That's taken me in many different places. I have been able to work around the world. I've had the opportunity to work with local community leaders, advocates, youth groups, as well as heads of state and world leaders and peacemakers. So it's been phenomenally transformative. But essentially, for the Diaspora Academy, after about 20 years of working on these issues, primarily the best way I capture it is to describe it as diasporas in development, is really what diasporas do in their day-to-day life is creating spaces that they wish existed. Now, anybody can really do this as an individual. If you're an ideator, if you're a creative, if you're a business, if you're a nonprofit, if you're a community advocate, whatever it is, if you're a researcher, anything, what you're essentially trying to do is solve problems or answer questions to alleviate some kind of hardship or drive some sort of efficiency, right? Make life better. But what we really see with diaspora communities is they're also really invested in creating ecosystems and spaces that they wish they had. So we believe firmly in the idea of creating the spaces that you wish existed. Now, what that means, hold on, let me just get back to this. So what that means is for the Diaspora Academy, our mission is really to support those diaspora change makers around the world and help them amplify their efforts and improve their effectiveness and their impact by learning, leadership development, and strategic partnerships. So taking what I've learned and taking what many of us from diaspora communities know so well to be true, and really scaling it up so that institutions, organizations, businesses, governments, the public-private partnerships can begin. As you know, track two diplomacy, in many ways, citizen diplomacy, exists with or without the state. It is an ongoing effort by communities and people around the world. For diasporas, they are a part of that ecosystem. But what is different is they are often focused on ways to engage the state or the government on policy outcomes. So I'm always thinking about what diasporas do to shape policy outcomes. And it can be specifically around legislation and around improving public policy, or it could be about showcasing who they are as constituents, as communities who deserve representation and service. Okay. So lastly, the reason we're focused on diasporas is because there's a significant gap when we talk about civil society and we talk about the state. There's a significant gap in identifying who's a member of civil society. We firmly believe that diaspora changemakers are a part of civil society, both in their ancestral homeland and in their adopted homeland, but they lack the support, guidance, and investment to really make that impact that they continue to make. I think many of you calling from around the world, you know that you have populations that live abroad that want to be engaged or that are engaged in local developments. And it can be a very polarizing discourse, whether it's helpful or harmful. But what we believe is if there's more investment and support to these diaspora communities abroad, and helping them become more impactful and efficient in the way they drive policy outcomes, development, economic, social, civic, cultural, whatever it may be. It not only maximizes the impact, but it aligns more closely with what local communities are seeking and demanding. Okay. So that's the theory of change, essentially. If they're more informed, engaged, and nurtured, then they'll maximize their social and economic investments and impact. It's important to note, I feel very strongly as the daughter of immigrants who's born in the United States. I feel very strongly about recognizing our place in the civil society ecosystem more accurately. I do believe that change, development, advancing policy outcomes, protecting human rights, pushing for good governance, pushing for peace and conflict resolution lives first and foremost with civil society and local communities in the countries where they're affected, because that they live the day-to-day realities and they know how things change over time. However, I also believe that diasporas are in many ways ambassadors and advocates for leading voices and partners on the ground. And so I argue that diaspora's role as citizen diplomats is to amplify what local civil society is calling for, or developing pathways for partnership with civil society. And oftentimes diasporas aren't aware of the breadth and depth of civil society initiatives on the ground. So what are the youth groups, the women's associations, the pastoralist society, the religious groups? They just don't have a window to that world. And so, peeling the curtain and showing them who are the main civil society actors on the ground is critical, as well as understanding the role that governments play. Because oftentimes diasporas go at it alone. They find their way. Okay, so with that in mind, so our company, this is what we do now: is the consulting, the courses, the coaching, and partnership. So we aim to bridge that gap. Okay. Now, I want to spend the rest of my time on walking through why diasporas are significantly impactful citizen diplomats and change makers. And to do so, we're going to need to walk through some of the introductory elements of what diaspora and diaspora engagement means. It is a term that has many interpretations, but in terms of practice and as a peace builder, I want us to really think of ways to empower ourselves collectively. When you think of the term diaspora, it's an all-encompassing term, and it applies to multiple groups. And it can apply to individuals who are migrants or immigrants or refugees. It can apply to asylees. It can apply to second generationers like myself. It can apply to multi-generational descendants. But there are some defining characteristics that you have to look for. So the term or the application of a diaspora perspective cannot be prescribed. It cannot be put on someone. It actually has to be a process of self-identification. And what we look for, or what really defines a diaspora, is their commitment and consciousness to remaining connected to the ancestral homeland from wherever they are. So we like to use this IOM, the United Nations International Organization of Migration, definition, which was initially introduced in 2013 at the first major convening of diasporas in development, where IOM brought ministers from governments around the world to begin addressing the role of diasporas in development as part of the Global Compact on Migration, Objective 19. This definition in 2013 is, I think, still the most all-encompassing. It has evolved quite a bit because of current circumstances around migration and development in mostly Europe, stemming from Asia and Africa and the Middle East. But I think this definition remains the most useful. And essentially, it's saying a few things: that you're an immigrant and their descendants who are living outside of your country of birth or ancestry. And it can be temporary or permanent. But what you're doing is you're still, from where you are, you're maintaining effective and material ties to their countries of origin. And so effective and material ties is really that determining factor. And that can look like a host of things I'll go into in a second. But it's just important to know that it's not enough to be a person of a certain heritage living outside of your country. You can have opinions, you can have thoughts, you can have an experience of living abroad as a fill in the blank. But it's really about the ways that you live and practice your relationship with your ancestral and your adopted homeland. Okay? So I should note, let me also just pause for a minute. No, I think it's too hard. No, I'll try it. So I should note, just in the interest of time, this is a very condensed presentation, but diaspora experiences are not unique to a particular region, continent, or group of people. It is a universal journey. And so you'll find what we're discussing to be true for diasporas that are from ancient times of the Arab, Jewish, African diasporas through 19th and 20th century contemporary migration groups, the Asians, the Caribbeans, more Africans, the Japanese, the Chinese. You'll see, and then to more recent years in the last 30 to 40 years, where we've seen a huge upsurge of migration from particularly Africa and the Middle East. But due to what we all know so well as peace building advocates and conflict resolution advocates, countries that are strife with war, and instability and poverty. So we run the risk. We have to avoid the temptation to think that diasporas is a cultural phenomenon that is due to trauma or suffering, but it's absolutely necessary to see the through line of diaspora experiences, regardless of what's prompted people to leave. Okay, so back to the presentation. So diasporas as citizen
Hard, just
diplomats.
so you know,
Okay?
you have about 4 minutes.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you, Paul. So diasporas as citizen diplomats, it's really is that soft power tool of people-to-people networks. And diasporas create these spaces to respond to needs on the ground, both here and there. We see it often in disaster response, in development initiatives, and diplomacy/peace peacemaking. So this kind of representation in major moments, oftentimes it's responding to needs in the ancestral homeland and or in the adopted homeland where we reside. And those responses often take on many forms of representation. And so these are the ways that we want to show, these are how diasporas organize as citizen diplomats. First of all, why do they matter and why do diasporas organize? Well, first, they're transnational actors. They're powerfully networked. They're active in their local communities. They're diverse and multi-generational. But most importantly, they have deep investment in the ancestral country's growth and prosperity. They also have transferable wealth and resources. And so these things of the mobility and the connectivity of diasporas and their desire to be change agents in their ancestral adopted homelands makes them ripe for engaging in formal and informal spaces around peace, development, and security. Of course, the challenges we often know as members of diasporas, these are the things we complain the most about. Oh, apologies, I left one. Oh, I just skipped to the end. Apologies there. We know that some of the challenges for diasporas, very divided, fragmented, politics gets in the way. For some diasporas, they don't have the means or an easy pathway to their ancestral homeland to physically participate. They're focused on crisis response. There's a bit of diaspora fatigue in having to always advocate for peace, stand up for ending of war. There is a real psychological effect for diasporas who engage consistently in this space for these seriously important policy outcomes. Most importantly, they're also resource strapped. Many diaspora initiatives like Citizen Diplomats are volunteer led. And as we look at ways forward, it's really about understanding the ways that diasporas organize in ways that they can be supported. So diaspora representation, we like to put it in 3 pillars. And I'm just going to go through, give you an overview of representation in the nonprofit sector, the for-profit sector, and the community sector. Now, some of these overlap, but generally speaking, diasporas will create nonprofits to serve their local communities and to serve communities in need back home. We see this these are the most visible entities. But if you look a little more closely, a diaspora representation also occurs in businesses where there's food, retail, hospitality, travel agents, remittance sending. These businesses are also representations of the diaspora and can serve as change agents for advancing economic growth or amplifying the impact, for instance, the impact of local immigrant-owned businesses in a country in Europe or in the United States. These are different elements of diplomacy and advocacy that we don't always think about, but they do end up, business associations end up being quite impactful. In the United States, one of the most influential business associations, diaspora business associations, is the Asian American Hotel Owners Association. Asian American Hotel Owners Association may not have a connection to Asian descendancy, but they've presented themselves as businesses that are owned by Asian American diaspora business owners, and from time to time they do engage in global issues. There's also many other examples of that. But most importantly, the one that's most relevant for this group is the community organizing. And it is the ways that peer to peer networking, knowledge transfer, skills sharing occur. This means spaces like this, where a diaspora organization may be able to transfer or train or communicate with local civil society actors, and vice versa. Civil society can explain to diasporas, this is what matters to us. Now, the challenge, of course, is whether or not diasporas are ready to hear proposals and recommendations that they don't have the same view on. But that's a different topic. We're talking about peace, not necessarily disagreement. So, what we know is that diasporas are creating the spaces they wish existed informally and formally. We know that they are connected to shaping policy outcomes, most notably around peace, uh, ending war, promoting global development, excuse me. But we know that their limited resources go a long way, but they are severely limited. So we always remind partners, whether you're a member of a diaspora or not, the diasporas really need investment, partnership, and philanthropic support. And if you want to help amplify the role of a particular people in driving a solution, it's important to not forget the diasporas. So, some recommendations we have for you. You can actually donate and support local and immigrant-led diaspora organizations, including businesses and nonprofits. But if you're at an institution, you can also look at what kinds of partnerships can be developed with diaspora organizations. I've worked with quite a few. I've worked with quite a few organizations and diasporas that have built partnerships. Very exciting for this space. You can also think of how to co-create programming for people-to-people knowledge transfer and skills building and relationship building. And of course, diasporas as diplomats, it occurs in the hallways of Congress, it occurs in the hallways of Europe, it occurs in the demonstrations happening in the street, but it also occurs in the day-to-day response to needs. And oftentimes with disasters, we have to remember that that's also a diplomatic moment where diasporas are first responders, responding usually invisibly. But so these are all the different spaces that diasporas are really active on diplomacy. So we thank you. And if you have more questions, this is our website, thediasporaacademy.com. And I will hand it over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Semhar. I'm going to ask you guys to turn on your cameras for a moment before we switch to Kadir in order to take a screenshot of everybody. And because we usually do screenshots, and we'll be sharing that out to a wider public along with some screenshots of our presenter slides and so on. So on three, if you can smile, 1, 2, 3, smile. Fantastic. Thank you for participating in that. We are going to proceed directly to Kadir, who is likewise going to be speaking for 15 minutes, and then discussion. I do want to emphasize, I posted in the Zoom chat that you should begin to ask questions and write comments in the Zoom chat. Those Zoom chat comments and questions are going to be shared out to a broader audience. So it's not just for this audience, and it will help us to kind of structure the discussion coming up. So by all means, throw your questions and comments in the Zoom chat. Kadir.
Yes, thank you, Paul, for the invitation. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit distracted. As I explained to Paul earlier, there was a martial law declared in Korea until a couple of minutes ago. The National Assembly just lifted it. Hopefully, it will turn out better. So I'm kind of following the unfolding developments in Korea in real time. So I'm sorry for being distracted. So I was asked by Paul to introduce careers in citizen diplomacy, especially in research area. My name is Kadir Jun Ayhan, by the way. I'm sorry, my name appears here as my company's name. I need to change it maybe later on. So I'll begin with first addressing citizen diplomacy research within academia, and then turn to non-academic research on the topic. In academia, it's a very new field. There are many different ways to put it: citizen diplomacy, people-to-people diplomacy, a subset of public diplomacy, a subset of maybe cultural diplomacy, and many other ways. Some colleagues found 236 or some other forms of hyphenated diplomacies. So citizen diplomacy is probably one of them. So most of this research is not really called citizen diplomacy, or most of research related to citizen diplomacy is not necessarily called citizen diplomacy, or sometimes not even hyphenated diplomacy. Especially within political science, probably the most important aspect of citizen diplomacy is studied under the realm of, or under the subfield of conflict resolution. So between different adversarial groups, for example, such as, for example, South Koreans and North Koreans, which is one of my research areas, inter-Korean people-to-people exchanges or cultural exchanges, or Armenia and Turkey and so on. So most of the research is done within this field. A related subfield is related to social identity studies, which can be again studied under social psychology, political communication, again, maybe within conflict resolution under political science. So we find many studies that focus on intergroup communication. So how do we make sure that we have positive contacts between different groups? So there is some research in that field as well. Another area that is looking at citizen diplomacy is communication. So it could be media studies, it could be communication studies, it could be public relations that focus on the communication aspect of the programs. And as I said, I started with academia. If there are any participants who are interested in an academic career and they're interested in citizen diplomacy as a topic of study, I would like to emphasize that much of research in citizen diplomacy or the broader public diplomacy is interdisciplinary. But what you need to take into account, if you have to get like one takeaway from my lecture, I think it would be this. There are almost no or very little number of interdisciplinary jobs in academic job market. Most of the jobs are discipline-based. So if you're applying for political science jobs, no one is really looking for someone who has focused on citizen diplomacy. Or if you're, looking for jobs in communication, sociology, psychology, no one is really looking for this. You would probably have a better chance of finding an academic job if you can find the intersection between the more mainstream subfields accepted in the field of your research, in the field of your PhD, and citizen diplomacy, if that's really what you're interested in. So that's probably, so the most likely discipline is probably communication. They are more open to, especially if you are studying communication aspects of different kinds of citizen diplomacy programs. Again, social psychology, if you are interested in especially social identity aspects of citizen diplomacy. Political science, I would not really recommend you to focus on citizen diplomacy if you're interested in finding a job in political science, especially in the United States, maybe not so much elsewhere. But if you really want to do that, probably you should focus more on the political aspect, especially conflict resolution of citizen diplomacy. So when it comes to conflict resolution of citizen diplomacy, and I think I can connect this with the second part of my lecture, which is on non-academic jobs. So let me share a blog post I have written. I'll just briefly mention it and I'll share the screen. So this is just a blog post I've written a couple of years ago. It was during COVID. Typology of people-to-people diplomacy. So if you just look at this table, so some of these citizen diplomacy or people-to-people diplomacy initiatives are organized by, led by governments, initiated by and sponsored by governments, such as, for example, Fulbright program, IVLP, New Colombo Plan, and so on. So there is a need to evaluate these programs because these programs are sponsored by taxpayers' money. So are these programs making a difference? Is it worth to make an investment in these programs? So because these are governmental programs or government-sponsored programs, most of the time, evaluation of it or research on it or design of these programs would require research that is also sponsored by the government. So the government would look for contractors or subcontractors to do research. That research could be process evaluation. Process evaluation, by the way, is done at the goal setting stage. So what are our goals? What is our framework, theory of change regarding these programs? And then outcome evaluation. Have we achieved the goals that we have set? So most of the time, the government looks for contractors. So there you have non-academic research on citizen diplomacy. So research firms, I have myself have a small boutique research firm that's doing evaluation for this kind of programs called Diplomacy Analytics LLC based in Maryland. So this is often government sponsored. On the other side, we have bottom up. So these programs are initiated by non-state actors, the citizens, the grassroots. But most of the time, the program goals are in line with the government's objectives. So they're not necessarily adversarial. An example could be, for example, this research looks at Greece-Turkey peace workshops. So again, related to conflict resolution. So you still want to evaluate these, but who evaluates it? Not necessarily the government, because it's initiated by maybe nonprofit organizations or universities or some other civil society actors. So they may be the program organizers or the sponsors might be interested in evaluating their outcomes, or they may need help with design of these kind of workshops, or again, process evaluation at the goal setting stage. So they may ask for someone to do this research or evaluation for them. So it could be freelancers, or it could be again firms that can do this kind of research. I also have done similar research on inter-Korean people-to-people diplomacy related to this. Sorry, this one is a little bit different. This research was on WANK, which is a Korean nonprofit organization that tries to connect South Korean youth with youth from overseas, so that their first image of Korea is my friend's country. It's a very interesting NGO. Sometimes the government initiates citizen diplomacy programs because there is no other way of doing diplomacy with another country. So there is some missing link, for example, as in, for example, United States people-to-people diplomacy initiatives with relatively adversarial countries such as Iran, North Korea, and so on. So most of the time, this research is done by academics, because nobody would sponsor this kind of research, or it's not very common to find sponsors for this kind of research. So it's not much done by non-academics. It's usually done by academics. Also similar here. Again, adversarial. So sometimes you have citizens doing programs opposing their government's traditional diplomacy line. For example, Russia has certain foreign policies. They have an adversarial stance, for example, against the United States, But you have certain NGOs or nonprofit organizations or civil society actors, whatever you want to call them. They want to portray a different Russia. My good friend Anna Popkova, she has done a lot of research on this, published at least 3, 4 articles on this. Um, so again, most of the research related to the activities of these kind of adversarial actors are often done by non-state actors. So if you want to, are done by academics. So most of the research is just out of academic curiosity, is done by academics, but there is not much room for academics to study these kind of interdisciplinary topics unless you find a firm ground in the mainstream area of the discipline that you have got your PhD in. But if you want to stay outside of academia, but still want to do research related to citizen diplomacy, I think um, the government sponsored programs or programs that are in line with government's official foreign policy line, may find you may find some room to do research on these because there are opportunities for freelancers as well as research firms to find opportunities, subcontracting or contracting opportunities to do this kind of research. And how do you find careers in these? You need to look up organizations that get these kind of contracts. For example, IIE in the United States, Meridian International Center, sister cities, Global Ties US, and these kind of like large organizations are often the major contractors of the State Department running these kind of programs. So they may often need researchers, evaluators working for them. There are also many other research or international development organizations that have huge research departments such as IREX, FHI 360, and also communication or media related public relations firms or research firms may also need evaluators and researchers such as District Communications Group and a few others. So you may look for careers or open positions at these organizations to do research within this field. But I guess evaluation is probably the majority of the positions in non-academic roles to do research.
Kadir, you have about 3 minutes.
Yes, I'm done. So that's it. So again, this is what I do. I've recently changed careers myself. Just to briefly talk about it, I was doing academic research in Korea. I was a researcher of public diplomacy. I was at an interdisciplinary department. I was at Graduate School of International Studies at Iowa Women's University, which is interdisciplinary, and my research has been very interdisciplinary. Hence, I had the luxury of studying whatever I wanted related to people-to-people diplomacy, as well as other aspects of public diplomacy, mainly at the intersection of foreign policy and public diplomacy programs. I'm currently affiliated with George Washington University's Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication. But here, most of my research is now commercial. I do research for companies and organizations that are interested in people-to-people diplomacy initiatives, evaluation, program design, and other research. So that's it. I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thanks, Kadir and Semhar, for your comments. I will share to the Zoom chat. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, for those of you who joined us late, our third speaker, Farhat Asif, would have been joining us from Pakistan, but unfortunately, there's political unrest there. The government has shut down the internet, so she can't join us. But I will share a couple of her websites. One is a diplomatic news site, and then the other one is her organization, so that you can get a sense of the kind of work that she does and that she's carved out for herself in this space of citizen diplomacy. So that said, questions from you guys. We have about 35 minutes to talk about your questions. So I encourage you, and to the extent that Semhar and Kadir are willing to entertain your questions about how they personally got into citizen diplomacy work, the challenges that they're facing, how they make an income from this kind of work, and other things. You could ask, for instance, Kadir, why did he decide to switch from academia into what he's doing now, and then and so on. So there are all kinds of questions to be asked. That may not have to do with diasporas or with research, but rather with their actual personal journeys, and both the opportunities and the challenges they face. So I encourage you to ask questions. So who would like to go first? If you would, please raise your hand electronically. That's the most helpful. If you know Zoom well enough, I think there's basically a kind of a tool you can use essentially to raise your hand electronically. It would be great if you do so. Otherwise, I will also kind of mine the comments and the questions that you've posted in the Zoom chat. Kazi, if you could indicate what country you're joining us from, and go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity. I am from Pakistan. My name is Qazi Bismillah. I'm from Pakistan. And my question is from the second speaker. I would like to do PhD and on the topic of what would we could say citizen diplomacy. So how he could manage to give me a direction to give me some guidance about this opportunity through which he talk about now. Thank you very much, sir.
Dear?
Yes, I think I may not have been very bold enough or blunt enough to say it, but I'll say it now. If you are interested in citizen diplomacy and if you want to do PhD, wait until you get a tenure track job. Because I mean, personally, I had a tenure track job that I left in Korea, but before that, if you do citizen diplomacy research for your PhD, it may be difficult to find a position because there are no positions at any university in the world that is advertising. On and then within the subfield, look for the opportunities or the popular subfields nowadays. For example, if your PhD is going to be in political science within the United States context. Again, I cannot know the Pakistan context, but for example, within the United States context, the focus is on American politics or security studies. So then your subfield should be related to a field like this so that you increase your chances of finding a job. Because without jobs advertised, you cannot continue to do your research on citizen diplomacy as an academic. Once you find your tenure track job, check with your department if they're okay with this kind of research, if it would help you get your tenure in academia. And then once they are okay with it, then you do your research on citizen diplomacy. So the alternative is finding jobs in academia that are interdisciplinary, but those are very rare. In Korea, for example, I came from Korea. In Korea, I worked for 3 different graduate schools, and all were interdisciplinary. Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University, same Graduate School of International Studies at Hanguk University of Foreign Studies, and most recently, Graduate School of International Studies at Eva Ulmus University. All were interdisciplinary, so my research on public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy was perfectly fine for me to get tenure. I don't know if that answers your question. I don't want to be
Yes,
discouraging.
It's not necessarily discouraging, although I think it has to probably be qualified. Actually, just relatively recently saw a position. I forget with what university. It was in Chicago, and and it actually mentioned citizen diplomacy, and it was, as far as I know, a tenure track position. But
Yes,
we have
very rare.
yeah, so they may be rare, but it's worth noting that citizen diplomacy is kind of this burgeoning field. More and more formal diplomacy is taking it into account, and hence why this position kind of surfaced, I think. So I may be a little more hopeful than Kadir, but I'm wondering if Anna Popkova can chime in as well, because she's likewise doing some research and writing on citizen diplomacy at the University of, I think it's West Michigan. And so if you could speak up, chime in if you would.
Yeah, thanks,
I
Paul. Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Popkova. Kadir, hey, great to see you. We're friends. We go back to, we're also birthday buddies. So, yes, I think I agree with what Kadir said, and I also wasn't sure, Kazi, what Kazi was asking about getting a job in doing citizen diplomacy research, already having a PhD in this field, or getting a PhD in this field. Like I wasn't actually sure, but I think
I think he wants to get a PhD.
get a PhD, yes. And I think that's where it's also quite similar to what Kadir said, because I agree, Paul, that it is kind of gaining momentum. The scholarship on citizen diplomacy and the recognition both by the diplomatic studies scholars within political science, IR, international relations, and then there's, the communication studies people. But there's still, in terms of like jobs, official jobs, I think a lot of it comes down to just the way academia functions and what kinds of majors students want to pursue, because that's where the money comes from. So typically, researchers that do citizen diplomacy would be housed in more traditional programs in political science, international relations, or in my case, I'm this odd person in my department who, and my PhD is also actually in journalism and mass communication. That's where I'm coming from. And then I teach public relations. And that's a nice area to be in because that's what students want. It's very practical. There's a lot of jobs out there in PR compared to citizen diplomacy, right? But I'm able to do my research while I teach courses, traditional courses in public relations, because of, again, the way at Western Michigan University where I work, because of the way just we are, I have a lot of freedom in terms of what I can research and what kind of niche I can carve for myself as a scholar. So in terms of both getting PhDs and then getting jobs after a PhD, I would, my advice would be to look still within the more traditional disciplines, but then look at faculty members and what they research. Because if you're looking into getting a PhD, getting into a PhD program, the best way would be to read the, like, what the individual professors do, what kind of research they do, and then basically saying, this is what I want to do. Can I work with you? And then that's one way to, that is kind of a better route to be in a more traditional program, but that has faculty who do that sort of research, who can accept you as advisee, and then you can do that research with them and under their supervision, and then they get a PhD in that.
I'm wondering if we can turn to Semhar here, because and Semhar, thank you for your engagement with the questions in the Zoom chat. But one of the remarkable things that Semhar shared in the Zoom chat was that diaspora funding actually exceeds total overseas development assistance. If you measure, including all these kind of remittances, philanthropic projects, and then public-private partnerships with governments. And as you might, I think some of you are aware, in countries like El Salvador and the Philippines, remittances actually comprise a significant proportion of their GDPs. In other words, the money that these diaspora communities are sending back to their homelands are really a significant part of the economy. And so that I would imagine somehow creates opportunities for citizen diplomats to find work or to derive income. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that. I think you're perhaps best positioned or better positioned of our two speakers to talk about kind of the varieties of ways as a kind of entrepreneur to make a living from that diaspora
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Thank you. So, what's interesting about the funding from diasporas is it's usually in response to addressing poverty alleviation, as they say, or crisis response, or maintaining people's livelihoods month to month. So, rent, school, livelihood, just sort of day to day. A lot of those figures are the numbers that we have, around approximately $870 billion a year total globally. That's actually still less than I think what it actually is sent, because that's what's recorded and that's what's captured in the data. So we know that diasporas are sending money regularly and not reporting it. So we know that there's a deep investment for diasporas in helping livelihoods. When it comes to becoming a citizen diplomat or engaging more officially as diplomats in some civic way, a lot of that depends on the willingness of the government, either the ancestral homeland or the adopted homeland. And the ancestral homelands, their view on their migrant populations abroad and whether or not they have diaspora policies is sort of the first question you have to ask yourself. If you're in a country where they are open and encouraging for their migrant populations to be involved in homeland policies. So what does that mean? Some countries like the Philippines outsource migrant populations and encourage migrant populations to live a diasporic way, to give back economically, and to be involved socially, culturally. The question is, how many of these governments, like the Philippines, also want these diasporas to be a part of policy and civic outcomes, right? So human rights, governance questions, transparency and accountability, justice, sorry, I've just lost my blank, but conflict resolution. So a lot of these governments are oftentimes hesitant unless the governments realize that their diasporas are quite influential in driving the outcome that the government wants. So some examples of citizen diplomats where they have been deeply involved and influential and governments are open are countries, I would argue, largely European diasporas right now in the contemporary fashion. We see Ireland, Italy, Germany, Poland, of course, and a lot of these countries with mid-level economies where the relationship isn't as disparate, right? They're not diasporas in a high-level country sending remittances to a low-income country. There's a sort of symbiotic lifestyle, right? So the role of Ireland and the Irish diaspora as peace builders was phenomenal with the peace process in the early 90s. And so we look for models like that. Unfortunately, in the global South, governments are still developing, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, still developing their diaspora policy frameworks. And diasporas have been deeply involved in engaging in citizen diplomacy, mostly to end wars or to resolve suffering on the ground. And that means that there's a bad actor. And governments haven't yet really grappled with the role that these diasporas play. Also, just on the whole citizen diplomacy idea as a profession, two things. I think I shared this with you, Paul, but I had, and Debbie might know, but I had the opportunity to work very closely with Joe Montville in my days in Congress, who is one of the architects of this whole idea of track two diplomacy. And his point to me was always that track two diplomacy has to remain informal. And it has to remain informal and not become overly, it's interesting to go back to this now, not to become overly formalized, because we need those ambiguous gray areas. So what led to the rapprochement between US and China during the Nixon administration was sports diplomacy and the idea of playing sports in the Olympics, not overtly saying we have to deal with XYZ issue, but creating a gray space. And so for citizen diplomacy, I, as a diaspora advocate, also realized some of this still has to stay in the middle. It has to stay in the gray. So what does that mean? You can be a nonprofit founder, you can be a nonprofit advocate and be a citizen diplomat, or you can be a business owner. That's why the examples I gave, those are vehicles to engage in citizen diplomacy and amplify a social justice issue you might want to address. And even in that pathway, those are still, I mean, Paul, you have a lot more insight on this, but like those are the pathways where citizens are invited to be a part of the formal state level diplomacy ecosystems like the UN, to become an observer, have observer status as a CSO, or to become a partner or a member of a high level delegation. Oftentimes, you have to first be a nonprofit or a civic association, a civic organization. So we're still pursuing traditional paths of in terms of the model, but the end goal and the mission is citizen diplomacy. Like I've worked in formal diplomatic spaces and I've chosen to move to informal because I think the informal is more powerful. Because when you work for institutions, and not just in diplomacy, but even as an employee, when you work for an institution, you have to cater to the institution's mandate and their priorities. And it's very difficult to deviate or enrich in their thinking, let me say that. And because diasporas are hyphenated, because diasporas are transnational, because diasporas have a worldview that is global in so many ways, most institutions don't have the agility to allow for what diasporas will think. And simply put, diasporas are innovators. And I would argue that citizen diplomacy is an innovative space, and it has to remain in that innovation. I briefly worked in private sector, in the tech sector. And in the tech sector, we were always reminded that your work is 1% done and that you've always got more work to do. And so there was never really a point where even in the most formal private sector employment spaces, did you feel like you made it? You were encouraged to always think, we're not there yet. So I am beginning to really understand that diaspora engagement and citizen diplomacy needs to be validated for that ambiguous, agile space, because diplomacy right now is between states. And the role of non-state actors in diplomacy is what we're really trying to change and get the international system to understand, the international community to understand that the role of non-state actors is critical. So the more examples we can give of citizen diplomats in these demographics, I think is critical.
Great, Semhar. Debbie Trent is with us and was nodding her head. And I'm wondering if, Debbie, if you would be willing, I don't know if she's paying attention, if you'd be willing to share your opinion as somebody who's likewise part of a diaspora, if you could explain what you do and what you're up to and chime into what Semhar said.
Well, I'd be happy to. I put something in the chat, Paul, but I think Abir also had a question. Maybe I should go after her?
Sure.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Debbie. Hi, everyone. My name is Abir. I'm from Algeria. Currently, I'm a student at the Cattolica University in Italy. I'm studying advanced studies in public and cultural diplomacy and international relations. My question is coming from a country from North Africa where we have like a large community in Europe, especially in France and in Montreal. We can't do it all. So where should be our main focus to be? Is it in influencing policy in our host countries or in our home countries? Thank you.
Semhar, you might be best equipped for this, but Kadir, afterwards, you're welcome to.
Well, I will say first and foremost, so nice to see you. The Algerian diaspora is another really strong community in Europe, as you've noted, but also around the world. It's important to know that diasporas, remember, we're not all one people, right? We're not a monolith. And so part of the work we all have to do from our respective communities is begin to develop the skill to unpack diasporas. So you're going to look at you're going to look at generational. You're going to look at first generation, second generation, multi-generational. There's 3 or more very different lived experiences in that subset. And if you're dealing with first generation diasporas that have left home and have memories of home, then you have to, that question becomes very important because it's personal. And when you look at just that demographic alone, you start to realize there's so many different interests, so many different experiences, so many different parts of the country that they're from, and so many different relationships with the state back home. So I think one thing we have to really think carefully about is disaggregating diasporas and being very specific with who do you mean when you say, what can we do? So you might say, And then I think even before that, the first thing is you have to know what you care about first. You have to be dead center committed to what you believe in. It could be girls' education, it could be clean water, it could be climate justice, it could be anything. But whatever you are committed to has to be the first thing you answer. Then you start to identify within a diaspora community where your partners are in that space. And disaggregating diaspora community is a whole process. Like we do a lot of trainings on this for partners and for communities because it's really hard to tell our people, hey, I know you want to help all the Eritreans or all the Algerians, but we're not all the same. We love our country the same, but if you're an Eritrean living in Switzerland and an Eritrean living in America, those are two very different experiences. It tells two very different migration stories, two very different contemporary ancestral stories, you know? So North Africa is phenomenal, though, because of its proximity to Europe and the way you're able to go back and forth. You're kind of in the middle. And so I have a very good friend who he's since passed away, but he was a phenomenal diaspora advocate, Tunisian, French, a friend of mine named Karim. And Karim would go between advocating for France policies and then go to the African Union and advocate for Pan-African policies, and of course, Tunisia. But, he felt that hyphenated reality and he lived it. And I would say that if you were to say you felt strongly about addressing local, ancestral, and adopted, you can do it. But what I strongly advise anyone to do with the diaspora engagement is to never project what you think other diasporas should be doing, because no one knows their experience. There's a couple slides that I had to leave out for the sake of time, but the diaspora journey, the terms of departure, migration, and arrival really determine an individual's sense of self and sense of responsibility and relationship that they want the homeland. So if your departure and your migration and your arrival have been difficult or deeply polarized or politicized, you may not want to be involved, right? You see what I mean? So, I would say when you find what you are really focused on and want to commit yourself to, you will find other allies within your respective diaspora communities and others, Pan-African, Pan-Arab, Pan-whatever. Yeah, it's great, Abir. Nice to meet you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Debbie, did you want to chime in?
Sure. So I'm a diaspora geek from way back, but I'm also just a halfie. So I present as just like a very vanilla white American person. But
Can you
my
explain
better half is Lebanese.
Oh, okay. So yeah, Lebanese American.
So I've had this very sort of mixed and always dynamic sort of sense of identity in academia, in private, in nonprofit practice, and so on. But I've just chosen to go advocate for climate protection. At this point in my remaining years of physical and intellectual ability. So what I've in federal government, when I was a civil servant in public diplomacy and in the nonprofit and private world, I've learned that academics and practitioners will constantly be debating what is the line separating citizen and official diplomacy. You're never going to get full agreement on it. So I love this concept, and I think it keeps being evidenced to me of light touch diplomacy, where, as I put in the chat, official diplomats really use and also cultivate the private citizen diplomats who can go under the radar, around the radar, and do stuff that officials can't do or won't admit that they do. So, we need to help them, to partner with them, but always watch our own backs and remember that reality.
Thanks, Debbie. I think this actually dovetails to kind of one of the ways in which, speaking of careers in citizen diplomacy, one of the ways in which you can develop your abilities and your capital, so to speak, as a citizen diplomat is through convenings. And so I want to share with you my screen briefly because the third, as I mentioned, the third speaker was not able to join us. Asif Farhat is doing just that kind of thing. So she does research as well, like Kadir. But she is, so by the way, I shared this in the Zoom chat so you can connect with her if you're interested. And by the way, I do encourage our speakers both to share their links to their LinkedIn profiles if they are willing to connect with folks. But this is so she has two websites. One is for the organization, the Institute of Peace and Diplomatic Studies that she established. So that organization has meetings, does research. But she also has a news site, this site, the Diplomatic Insight. So she does media, so in other words, news reporting. But in the process, she's done a lot of convening of different groups. So one group that is to a great extent interested in citizen diplomacy are students, and there are lots of students, university students in particular, across the world who are interested in citizen diplomacy. And so she does, among other things, convenings of students with formal diplomats and citizen diplomats. And so that's one way, and she can get paid for that kind of thing when the government or some sort of a nonprofit or business even is willing to kind of to sponsor those kinds of convenings. And in some cases, universities as well. So I just wanted to share that convening people is one of the key things that can build your acumen as a citizen diplomat. Other questions or comments? Actually, Layla, you had earlier on, and I'm sorry it's been I haven't gotten to your questions and as yet, but do you want to chime in with the questions that you had if they haven't been answered?
Sure. I mean, part of it, what the first part was kind of answered, but hi, I'm Lila. I'm coming from Washington, D.C. Graduated from the Elliott School, represent. Um, this is not on purpose. And I guess the second part of my question is like I have experienced firsthand and promoted myself citizen diplomacy within some of the diasporas that I know somehow to mention, and I'm wondering like what other specific examples are there? Because I think citizens diplomacy and a lot of this work is just it's the formalizing of that unofficial work I've done through individual families, for example. Yeah, basically, how can I turn it into a paid career? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that it's a question I'm always wrestling with every day. When I'm an employee, I say I have to leave, I have to do my work, and then when I'm doing myself, I'm like, how do I make this? First and foremost, I think in your case, from what you shared, I taught at GW, so it's nice. I was at Elliott School, so it's nice to see you. I think the first and most important thing for yourself, I'm only just going to speak to you about this, is and actually, no, this can apply to everybody. I think when it comes to change making and really trying to make social impact, whether you're a citizen diplomat or a community organizer or anything, is you ask yourself three very, very fundamental questions to give you that North Star and that compass, because then you can do risk analysis when any opportunity arises, whether it's in alignment with what you really want to do and believe in or not, right? Instead of a paycheck or a security, which will come. I'm also a believer in that. First and foremost is who are you seeking to serve? And when you look at your work from a place of service and servant leadership, and you really believe that leadership and impact comes by serving those most in need, like in my view, that's what I carry. I have to think carefully about who that means, because I worked abroad. I worked in East Africa. I worked in different countries around the world. And there was a significantly acute need from a livelihood standpoint. And that to me was paramount. And then over time, that answer started to change, but I want to stay on track with you. So who are you seeking to serve? And the second question is, who are you seeking to influence? Because whether you're an academic or a practitioner, you're basically trying to forge new thinking or make policies and livelihoods better. So you've got to influence to get these certain outcomes that you want. So who are you seeking to serve? Who are you seeking to influence? And then lastly, I would say, who are you seeking to represent? Because who you're seeking to serve is a different segment than who you might be, right? Who you're seeking to influence may not be who you are. So when you come forward to those two audiences, and I hate to call them audiences, but they are, it's really about who do you represent? And that question for me was always the issue. And I started to realize, well, I represent the diaspora view. You know, even though I worked in the Eritrea Ethiopia peace process and I'm Eritrean, I was born in New York. So, you know, I was the only diaspora member from the entire team, the legal team. Um, I started to realize that I was representing a diaspora voice. And that's valid. It doesn't have to be one or the other. So serve, influence, and represent really helps you understand your compass. If you're seeking to serve diaspora communities, then there, you know, like Paul and his experience with the citizen diplomacy space, diaspora engagement space is starting to grow. It is opening up for a professional pathway. Years and years of work. This is why I know people like Debbie from back in the day when I was on the Hill, and it's really lovely to see the same people that committed. But you're also making a commitment which will go probably the rest of your professional path, right? If you're really committed to who are you serving. And so professionally, it looks like more nonprofits are having focus on diaspora communities, particularly since, you know, it's really unfortunate that the Ukraine crisis resulted in more attention to diasporas because that displacement changed international communities' calculations on diaspora engagement significantly. For people that are not from Ukraine, there's a feeling of why wasn't it until Ukraine? Why did diasporas not matter until Ukraine? But the other side is, okay, well, the Ukrainian diaspora crisis is a reality, and now the world gets it. I'm in that view. Of course, I'm wishing that it had been realized before. But I would say in this particular movement around diaspora engagement, the Ukraine crisis and the massive displacement has resulted in Western capitals finally paying attention to this, Western actors and funders being willing to put more money into it. But it's primarily for those diasporas. So that's why I said it really matters who you want to serve, because they're not the same. You know, if you're in the you're in DC. If you deal with an Ethiopian or El Salvadorian diaspora, I'm also in DC, or Somali, that's very different than a Ukrainian diaspora set of needs. And it would not be fair for you to assume that they're the same. So maybe my first message for my presentation should have been diasporas are not a monolith. So the more precise you get in who you want to serve, like what state are you from, Layla?
I'm from California.
So let's say you want to work with diasporas from California across the United States, right? That commits you to work and a pathway at the state level, at the city level, at the national level. It may not be in DC, but it's okay if you leave DC to go to Cali if you're that committed to who you're serving. Okay, so that's kind of the premise of the calculations you want to make. There, you will find like my resume, my portfolio. It's what they call a portfolio career. I've been everywhere, but not because of poor performance. It's because I've got a through line in my work since 2007. And that through line is diasporas. And I didn't understand how powerful it was or how clear my through line was until I started looking at the pattern. Okay, so think less about the institution and the paycheck and more about who you're seeking to serve and how you can do it.
Thank you.
Great, Semhar. Kadir, I don't know if you want to chime in to any of this. I know you're paying attention to politics in South Korea, but your thoughts are welcome.
I don't have anything to add at this point, but if there's any specific question, because I've seen there's a lot in the chat, but I don't know if there's anything specific for me.
Can
I'll be
you
more than happy to
actually,
answer.
here's a question for you, Kadir, because if I may share, I know that you're in transition in part because in terms of your work, because your wife is in DC, had to be in DC, and if you could explain why you're changing and where you think you might be headed, that would be awesome. But also talk about your work at GW because this is a new position that you have
Yes.
that I think will help people to figure out like some of the possibilities with citizen diplomacy.
Yes. So I had an uneventful life in Korea. I mean, thinking about what's happening right now, it's very interesting. But yes, I was an academic tenure track in Korea. If it wasn't for my family, I think I would have stayed because Korea was kind of my comfort zone. I was in presidential committees working with this current president, which is not so much my favor, but anyways. So the reason why I moved is basically because of my family. But the other motivation was this is DC. This is not only the capital of the United States. This is also capital of international affairs globally, including also public diplomacy. So I thought there would be a lot of opportunities here. So I am still so one of my feet is still at academia. That's the George Washington part. I'll be mostly helping them research and business development, trying to increase the number of programs that they have, and also with research grants. But my other foot is in especially working with or for citizen diplomacy organizations that have government contracts, so subcontracting for them in terms of research and evaluation. So there is so much potential here in DC, which is not possible in any part of the world. Not so much in Korea, for example. In Korea, I was also doing a lot of government consultancy, also lecturing and researching, reviewing for different government agencies, including the presidency, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Korea Foundation, and so on. But the scale is very different here. So it's a bigger market. So there is a bigger potential for research outside of academia in every field, including also citizen diplomacy. So that's why Washington, D.C. is kind of special. I'm in transition. So I've just, for example, my role with George Washington University was supposed to begin actually in March. I received Fulbright scholarship to be at George Washington's Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communications, but I canceled it. I forgone that opportunity to be able to come here permanently. So it just started now. So in the next few months and years, maybe if we have an opportunity to talk about this again, I can tell you more. But for now, I see a greater potential here than in Korea. In Korea, I just had a boring life as an academic, just doing your own research and doing consultancy on the side without so much going on. Here, I think there is much more potential. By boring, I don't mean bad. I like boring.
Sometimes boring is safer. So I want to add to this, and I think this chimes in with what Anna Popkova just shared, which is so I shared a set of organizations. They are US centric. I apologize for that. They're all, but that's my vantage point as likewise somebody in the Washington, D.C. area. But Anna mentioned Global Ties US, which is likewise an American organization, but it underscores that one of the places where citizen diplomacy is alive and well is at the city level and at the community level. So, in fact, around climate change, which is an international phenomenon, there's a tremendous amount of collaboration among cities because sometimes at the national levels, not much can be achieved. And so at the city level, there's a lot of collaboration across borders. So you can take on an issue. I think this speaks to some extent to Semhar's point about kind of finding your niche, whether it's diasporas or it's climate change or something else, and then leveraging that expertise and those networks that you develop to advance your work. And I'm just opening up this possibility of city diplomacy because there's just a lot going on there. And then there are these, at least in the United States, and I know this is true in other wealthier nations, in major cities, it's not just capital cities, as well as smaller places like Kalamazoo, Michigan. There are where Anna is based. There are these world affairs or sister cities organizations, which are great to join. Oftentimes there may be a membership fee, but the point is that there are potential employment opportunities through those that come about, sometimes in business, sometimes in the nonprofit sector. There are all kinds of organizations like that dotting the United States and other kind of wealthy nations. So we need to actually switch to announcements because we're coming upon 12:30 Washington, D.C. time. And I'd like to turn us to Brian Smith, who I think is hopefully paying it. Yes, I think he's now paying attention. Um, so Brian is, as I mentioned, co-editor of our CD Bulletin, Citizen Diplomacy Bulletin, which comes out quarterly with each of these meetings. So he's going to share what's in the bulletin, and I will share afterwards, if I remember, some changes happening to the bulletin, which will be exciting and I think more interesting in the coming year. So Brian, if you would take it away, and I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the most recent CD bulletin that he largely created.
Thanks, Paul. And thank you for those wonderful presentations, really informative. And I feel like I've got some good things in the newsletter to reinforce some of those points. I did, in fact, start with Global Ties. We just talked about that a little bit. They're one of the leading organizations here in the U.S. Doing citizen diplomacy. And the typology that we learned earlier, they'd probably be a kind of a hybrid organization because they both do things that are supported by the State Department, but they also do a lot of work on their own in communities and citizen-based. And you'll see they're having their national meeting here in DC. That's where I'm based as well. In February, and it's stronger alliances, stronger communities is the theme. So that really speaks to both of the levels of the work they do, including this International Visitor Leadership Program, which is one of the oldest ways that U.S. citizen diplomats and international leaders can do exchanges here in the U.S. And they also are giving their Citizen Diplomat Award. And also for those of you looking for jobs, I decided I would put a note that they are actually hiring. I'd also, to the one looking for a PhD program, down here there's the School of International Training. They've actually created a new PhD program, one of which does focus on conflict resolution. So that discussion about how citizen diplomacy is a lot based in conflict resolution. You could learn more about that. And also, I would draw the attention to Peace Trees Vietnam. That was a very interesting organization that grew directly out of the post-conflict situation in Vietnam. And what they did was create exchanges and trips to actually clear out landmines and sort of undetonated ordnance that was kind of just scattered around the countryside. But since then, it has grown, and they do a lot of community-based education and development and bring people from the U.S. to Vietnam to help in that work. So I thought that was interesting that the notion of citizen diplomacy as conflict resolution, I think, has a practical side in this work. So, and then down just some interesting articles. We always put in recent new info on citizen diplomacy and all of its various manifestations. Science diplomacy, cultural diplomacy. Here's city diplomacy Paul was talking about on the bottom. And also there was a book recently published, 2023, that actually has one of Paul's pieces inside of that. So check that out. But some really interesting books, especially this Dear Unknown Friend. That's just actual citizen correspondence going back between U.S. citizens and people in the Soviet Union. So this work has been going on for a long time, but it's great to see and meet new practitioners with Citizen Diplomacy International. So, and then just down below, more organizations and lots of resources for everybody to dive into.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So to tell you guys a little bit about what's coming up in 2025 with the CD Bulletin, we are going to turn these resource pages, which have been kind of static with every issue, over to the Learning Life website. They'll always be available there. But we're going to use that open space to share profiles of researchers and practitioners of citizen diplomacy. And so that will be a new feature of the CD Bulletin, which should hopefully kind of help to enliven the bulletin further and give some flesh to this CD Bulletin. In fact, Semhar, you are one of the people I'm going to be following up with about that because we'd like to profile you among these people doing citizen diplomacy in different ways. So I'll be in touch with you. Um, and so I think we are at time. I just want to do two things. One is to thank our speakers, Semhar and Kadir, for their insights. You can find them on LinkedIn if they haven't shared their LinkedIn profiles. And you can find them online at their actual in the case of Semhar in terms of diaspora work. Um, I also want to note that if you are not already on our CDI email list, I will add you, and you'll be getting sometime soon some announcement of our meetings in 2025. We have not set the dates and the topics of those meetings as yet, but we will have again 4 meetings and 4 CD bulletins that will look a little bit different. And lastly, just to encourage you, if you haven't already, to join our Facebook and/or our LinkedIn pages. I'm going to post those in the Zoom chat. These are ways for you. There are 2 different links there, one to the Facebook group and one to the LinkedIn group, for you to share your work in citizen diplomacy in order to find out what other people are doing in citizen diplomacy. So with that said, thanks again to Semhar and Kadir. Thanks to all of you for joining us and asking questions, being active. Anna, great to have you with us and chiming in. Ellen, Debbie, if she's yes, still with us. Thanks for your time. Happy holidays, happy New Year, and see you in 2025. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.